Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live interactive panel discussion which addresses big questions currently facing researchers, policymakers, and planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading schools of international affairs, including the American University in Washington, D.C., Warwick University in the UK, Konstanz University in Germany, Ritsumeikan University in Japan, and the ISA in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Today's live stream production is entitled, How Achievable Are the Sustainable Development Goals? My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to be moderating the session today. A warm welcome to everybody joining us in the audience today, and there are many of you. We will try our best to direct any questions you may have to the appropriate panelists. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom panel, particularly towards the latter part of the session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those of you tuning in from outside of Canada, one of the actions we take here in Canada to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is a process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous people have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land on which we are situated in all that we do, including Global Insights. To start off today's conversation about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, let's turn to our distinguished panel. Derek Cogburn is professor in the School of International Service at the American University. His research and teaching includes global information and communication technology and socioeconomic development, institutional mechanisms for global governance of information and communication technologies, transnational policy networks and epistemic communities, and the socio-technical infrastructure for geographically distributed collaboration in knowledge work. He directs the Center for Research on Collaboratories and Technology-Enhanced Learning Communities, an award-winning social science research collaboratory investigating the social and technical factors that influence geographically distributed collaborative work, particularly between developed and developing countries. He has also served as a member of the high-level panel of advisors for the United Nations Global Alliance for Information and Communication Technologies and Development. Ken Konka is a professor in the School of International Service at the American University. His research and teaching focus on global environmental governance, environmental peace building in war-torn societies, environmental politics, and policy in the UN system, water governance, and environmental policy analysis. His most recent books are the Oxford Handbook of Water Politics and Policy and An Unfinished Foundation, the UN and Global Environmental Governance. He is the editor of the widely used teaching anthology, Green Planet Blues. Dr. Konka's research has been recognized with several prestigious awards, including the Grawemeyer Prize for Ideas, Improving World Order, the International Studies Association's Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for Best Book on Environmental Affairs, and the Al Moomin Environmental Peacebuilding Award. He's a member of the UN Environmental Program's Expert Advisory Group on Conflict and Peacebuilding. Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger is a professor of law in the Faculty of Environment, University of Waterloo, and an international advisor of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change. She serves as a fellow in the University of Cambridge and senior director of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. She received her International Judicia Regnorum Fundamentum Award in 2016. Her research focuses on international law and governance related to climate change adaptation, mitigation, finance and natural resources, investment, trade in the green economy, among other sustainable development challenges. Vanessa Schweitzer is an associate professor of knowledge integration at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment, director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and faculty member at the Balsillie School. She researches socioeconomic development as a determinant of climate risk and was a contributing author to the 5th assessment report of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Thank you to all panelists, everyone, for sharing your insights with us today. In order to know where the Sustainable Development Goals are going, it's helpful to know where we have been and how it is that we've arrived at this very important pivotal point. It's been 5 years now since UN member states committed to the SDGs, which were targets intended to improve environmental, humanitarian, social conditions worldwide. Ken, let's start with you. Where are these SDGs coming from?
Well, thanks, Anne, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you all this morning. The story of the SDGs really starts with the Millennium Development Conference, which was a global summit meeting that was held at the UN in 2000 to try to reinvigorate the process of development. In the wake of that meeting, there was a desire within the UN and the Secretary General to find some way to sustain the momentum from that meeting, which they feared would be lost. And so this led to the idea of setting some goals that could be striven for over the period 2000 to 2015. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, sought some of the same goals and themes as the SDGs, but they were developed by a very different process. They were defined by a very small group. It was very much a top-down and internal process of setting the goals. And it was really meant more to sustain political momentum behind the idea of development than to take a comprehensive look at the world's development challenges. The SDGs came about by a very different process. It was a much more widely participatory process. It was somewhat chaotic. There were competing processes at work in different parts of the UN before the Rio Earth Summit of 2012 started to consolidate things. And so the SDGs are far more comprehensive, they're much more ambitious, and they have more specific targets and measures for tracking progress.
Thanks so much, Ken. Vanessa, are there any ways in which the SDGs have been a success in your view?
Yes, I would say that the SDGs have been very influential in policy discussions. So this is great to hear Ken's perspective on telling us sort of the history of where they come from. As far as the influence that they've had, you can really see it in the scientific community that is working to provide policy relevant information on climate change, namely the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. Climate change is a global problem that really focuses people's minds on how approaches to economic growth and development influence the nature of the climate change problem. I happen to do a lot of work on the energy sector side, sort of understanding how emissions from the energy sector and other industrial activities will end up influencing how much temperature change we have, and therefore how much climate change we're committing ourselves to. But what is useful about the SDG framework is that it also speaks to other dimensions, other human dimensions of climate change, namely how much exposure and vulnerability different countries and communities might have, as well as human development, where from a climate change perspective, this really matters for adaptive capacity. So the research that's coming out of this scientific community has now really clearly shown that conventional development versus sustainable development leads to very different futures from a climate change perspective. And so this is where I would say the SDGs have been a success for providing this framework that helps scientists to articulate to national policymakers that the way that we approach development, both within our own borders and through international development projects, matters a great deal for global environmental change.
Thanks so much. Mary Claire, over to you. What are the most significant opportunities in your view for progress in achieving these goals?
Thank you very much, Anne. And actually, I don't know if I feel a little bit unusual here, having been involved in drafting the SDGs. I was serving as head of Sustainable Economic Development Department for the International Development Law Organization during the process of the open working group that put the Sustainable Development Goals together. And one of our tasks was to align the international treaty law that existed already for 30, 40, 50 years through the Rio process that Ken and others have mentioned, with the emerging targets and goals that were being put forward with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their 169 targets. And what I think one of our very important opportunities is in terms of actually achieving the SDGs is to build on the work that has been done through the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the UN Summit on Sustainable Development, the current high-level political forums that are held every year to examine country progress, but deepen it and make it more sticky. When we look at the policies and laws around us that affect water, that affect energy, that affect climate change, that affect biodiversity, we can see that some of them are actually preventing action on the SDGs, and others offer us a chance to go faster, further, and achieve some of the targets. So I think the most significant opportunities for progress have to do with making those changes fast to the entire enabling framework that we have in our societies, governments on all levels, policies on all levels, stakeholder engagement on all levels. It's not a question of saying, oh, I'm going to choose, this particular SDG today and that particular SDG tomorrow. It's a question of saying, I'm one student, I'm passionate about water, I'm going to work for the rest of my life on this SDG. Or I'm one government, I need to deliver all 17 of these. I'm going to set up the right ministries and departments to get all of these moving. But I'm going to put the most resources in the 6 highest priority places where we're failing today in our country, here. And that is something that I think the SDGs as a framework for global action together assist us with. That I think is what the strength is here. If we could achieve all of these SDGs by 2030, simultaneously, worldwide, we would have the dream society. And that's what it means to set aspirations as a world. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Derek, over to you. We've come from the SDGs to the MDGs. The MDGs to the SDGs. So tell us from your research perspective what the difference is between the two.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I have had the fortune of working with the global disability community for the last 10, 15 years. It's a diverse community. It is organized with a number of international networks. And it was really animated by the World Bank and the World Health Organization's report in 2011 that reported more than 1 billion people in the world living with some form of disability. So this is a critically important group as we think about sustainable development. And so that group has focused on disability inclusive development to make sure that this 1 billion people in the world are included in disability strategies. And during the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the negotiation around that, the phrase "nothing about us without us" became the mantra. And so that every policy issue, every development strategy that is about persons with disabilities should include them. And they've modified that now to say nothing without us, that everything is related to persons with disabilities and should be included. And if we look back at the Millennium Development Goals, they had, as Ken said, targets and strategies. They were developed by a very different process, and they didn't include persons with disabilities at all. There was no reference to persons with disabilities. And so you're trying to achieve these global development goals with more than 1 billion people in the world living with disability, and they don't include persons with disabilities. And so the SDGs have 11 specific references to persons with disabilities. And that has allowed the disability community to mobilize around those issues and to engage in the HLPF that Marie-Claire talked about and some of the other strategies.
Thanks so much. Progress indeed. Now we've discussed a lot of challenges moving forward. Marie-Claire, what are the greatest barriers to progress on the SDGs in your view?
I actually think there's 2. And these are the same barriers that have prevented action on over 100 directly related international treaty obligations. So when we fail in our achievements to actually deliver on the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals in any country, rich or poor, they apply to everybody, we also fail in achieving binding international treaty commitments that we've made over the last 3, sometimes 6 or 7 or 8 decades, really actually 3/4 of a century, as long as the UN has existed. And that's a serious, serious thing to be failing on. And we're always told it's for the same 2 reasons. The first one that we hear over and over again is lack of resources. Not just financial resources. You know, there are funds and mechanisms and financing instruments in almost every treaty regime. And there have been funds set aside, not just from aid budgets, but from the budget of your energy ministry or your environment and climate change ministry or your ministry that works on social development and economic affairs. So those budgets haven't been sufficient. In order to achieve the 169 SDG targets, we, in conservative estimates through the UN, require 5 trillion to 7 trillion a year, between 2.5 to 3.4 trillion in developing countries, just for basic infrastructure, food security, health, education, climate adaptation, and mitigation efforts. In the very poorest, least developed countries alone, the total investment gap is over 700 billion. So if we're looking specifically at what are our barriers, what are the gaps that we're creating, I think one of the most important ones up to very recently has been lack of resources. The other, and I'm afraid, Anne, here's where I pitch it back to you and to my colleagues, is lack of capacity. We have a chasm opening in front, right in front of our feet, with hundreds of thousands of brilliant young graduates coming out of our schools and educational institutions every year, and being sent to drive Uber and deliver pizzas. Not that that's not important, but I do think that it's quite key that if we have young lawyers, young engineers, young doctors, people from all different parts of the world that are trying to participate in a better economy, we need to have career paths for them so that they can contribute directly to the SDGs. And the ones they feel most passionate about should be the ones where we're opening the doors. I'm believing right now that if I look around, even just in my own area, international law, I work quite a bit on helping governments through the UN. Our research center assists in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And even in Canada, there's maybe 20 lawyers qualified in climate change, and about 12 of them are my former students. And yet, under the nationally determined contributions that 176 countries have registered out of 188 total that have registered, they are asking for legal institutional reform to achieve their SDGs 13 provisions and to achieve their Paris Agreement. So where are they going to get all those lawyers from? Those qualified lawyers, that is. And that's just one SDG, SDG 13, and one binding treaty, the Paris Agreement. Imagine all the way through. So I do think that the lack of capacity and the lack of resources are the two most important challenges. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks so much. So Derek, even with all these concerns about limited implementations, why do you consider the SDGs to be such an important platform?
I do, and thank you. I'm an optimist. I'm an eternal optimist, and so I am hopeful. And Marie-Claire has really highlighted some of the tremendous challenges, and not only the financial challenges, but the cognitive load of trying to deal with so many different targets and goals at the same time. But what makes me hopeful is we've talked a little bit about what are called grand challenges. So in the scientific community, grand challenges have been used to harness the attention of scientists and engineers and organizations to really focus on particular big problems. So you narrow around a set of big problems and you try to move everybody in that direction. So I have talked about the global grand challenge of disability and development. And one of the things that I'm so excited about with the SDGs, as I mentioned, with these 11 areas within the SDGs to focus on persons with disabilities, we now have a multi-stakeholder approach to address these issues. We have a global grand challenge. So the SDGs really help us to focus our energy and attention, not only with governments, but international organizations, the private sector, NGOs, all pulling in the same direction. So the degree to, I think everybody would recognize that the number of international organizations and NGOs that have aligned their strategies and their work towards achieving the SDGs is really critical. And so that movement and that force towards the same goals is, I think, what keeps me animated and optimistic about achieving them, or at least making progress on achieving them.
Thank you. Ken, how about you? The SDGs have been criticized as being too many, too complex. Are these concerns valid?
Well, that's a great question, and one I think we really need to engage. I mean, look, I think the bold ambition is important. One of the underappreciated powers of the United Nations historically has been in the power of ideas. Human development is a concept that was born in the United Nations. Sustainability is a concept that was born in the United Nations. Boldness is a key piece of transformational change. It captures people's imaginations. When the UN works best, it works kind of like a coral reef. And the idea, in some sense, and then the institutions championing those ideas are the reef, and all sorts of life forms can attach themselves to that reef, and pretty soon you have a whole ecosystem that's working for change. We saw that process work through decolonization. We saw that process work with the rise of ideas about basic human needs. We've seen that process work with the championing of new forms of human rights. And so I don't think the problem lies at all in the breadth or the ambition or the complexity of the goals. As we've started to say, and I'm sure we're going to get into in more detail as we go, the problem resides in the framework of domestic and global policies that either inhibit or in some cases work actively against the achievement of the SDGs, as Marie-Claire alluded to, and more broadly in a business as usual approach to development at a time when what we most need is an approach that's seeking more transformational change.
Vanessa, enter COVID-19. Will this make it more challenging in your view to achieve the SDGs?
And this is where I really agree with the comments from the panelists that what really matters right now is how governments respond to this painful disruption of the pandemic. There's basically the question of whether governments will choose to merely build back, or if they will see this as an opportunity to build back better. So if governments choose to build back just to sort of the pre-COVID, business as usual, conventional development, we sort of know how to do things in the way we've always done them historically, that's where the situation will be more challenging, I fear, for actually achieving the SDGs. Part of why I say this is because we actually saw this happen with respect to climate policy after the Great Recession of 2007, 2009. There were some countries that continued to move the ball forward on trying to transition their energy technologies and their energy economies, but there was significant momentum lost in North America to put prices on greenhouse gas pollution. So I would really hope that we don't see a repeat of that. Alternatively, if governments commit to building back better, perhaps using the SDGs and their targets as a guide, the disruption that we're experiencing now could be a new dawn where international institutions such as the International Energy Agency have in fact called upon decision makers to view this disruption as a fork in the road and an opportunity to improve coherence between things like clean energy policies and sustainable development.
Well, let me ask you to go on a little bit on this subject of multilateral cooperation. We've talked about the importance of governments stumping up around these frameworks, but from your perspective, even though President Trump was not reelected, might US isolationism as the leader of the global economy be a threat to the SDGs?
And Anne, unfortunately, I'll have to say the answer is yes, that this is still a threat. And there are two scenarios that make this clear in terms of what the climate change research community has examined. So the climate crisis, I just want to remind everyone, it's a long game because the lifetime of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is on the order of centuries. So this is why the climate change research community has looked at things like alternative scenarios for long-term trends in global development and perhaps global governance. And so for the 21st century, these communities examined 5 key scenarios, and I want to draw out 2 in responding to this question about isolationism. One is how the Trump administration could be seen as an example of what the research community has called a rocky road, where, as you mentioned, Anne, multilateralism is really what falls apart under that scenario. Naturally, if that were to happen, that would have cross-cutting effects for things like international trade, such as slowing down the ability of clean energy technologies to make their way through global energy markets, and also international policy priorities for things like infrastructural development of schools or clean water under the SDGs. These priorities fall by the wayside. So under this kind of scenario, what happens, what's interesting about this scenario is it is less that emissions get out of control if we're looking at sort of the climate change problem, but it's that the governance capacity to intervene in things like global markets and to steer them in the right direction, as well as adaptation policies, were sort of, we kind of examined what happens under these scenarios. It's adaptation that also really fails. So then you have the dual challenge of high challenges to adaptation as well as high challenges to trying to clamp down on greenhouse gas mitigation. But another example, which I would argue is kind of also isolationist, is if countries sort of pull back from international partnerships and perhaps focus on only achieving SDGs within their own borders, where countries maybe focus on their own capacities. And we examined a scenario which we called inequality, one where wealthy countries, for instance, perhaps they just focus on cleaning up things within their own borders, but they really step away from international partnerships. And what's interesting about this scenario is that, once again, if you let challenges to adaptation for countries that currently have more exposure, more vulnerability to things like sea level rise or extreme weather events, under these unequal scenarios, you can once again see that we are having a climate future we really don't want. So this is where, even though the SDGs have been criticized as being too complex, too ambitious, the fact that they are interconnected and that we can certainly see for a global change problem like climate change, that if we don't commit to really trying to advance all of them, we will end up with futures that we don't want. And so I wanted to close with looking at the language you had, Anne, for announcing this event. You used language referring to the SDGs, such as the SDGs being a blueprint, and that it calls on both developed and developing countries to come together in concert. I think we really have to take those words to heart, because when we understand a blueprint, we don't just focus on putting together a building by focusing on one beam at a time. You have to also look at the whole picture of what's the entire building supposed to look like. And similarly, coming together in concert, you know, the first chair in the violin section and the first chair in the trumpet section don't focus only on playing their own sheet of music perfectly. They also think about how they work together as part of an ensemble to create the piece that we want.
Thanks, Vanessa. Ken, your research looks at human rights. To what extent are the SDGs human rights centered?
Well, the activist in me wants to say that they're not, but I think a fairer answer would be to say they are not consistently centered in that way. And in fact, this was one of the major disappointments of many civil society groups when the SDGs were being hammered out and negotiated, that they didn't take a more consistently rights-based approach as the starting point for defining the goals and defining the pathways to the goals. A good example is the Sustainable Development Goal on water, goal number 6. It's a bold goal. It seeks the elimination of water deprivation and water poverty on the planet. And it seeks to protect the freshwater ecosystems that are the ultimate source of those water supplies, all of which is terrific. But it doesn't contain any recognition of the existence of a human right to water, which the General Assembly did identify right in the midst of the process when the SDGs were being hammered out. And it's that sort of incorporation of rights-based approaches that I think provides some of the political energy that sometimes is lacking. You know, rights-based approaches, they start with a premise of equality, of non-discrimination, of active participation by all stakeholders, and of accountability. And those are not just abstract and theoretical notions. You know, that's where the political energy for change can come from. And that's where you can keep things moving forward and in the lane that they need to be in. A phrase we often hear around the SDGs is that they should leave no one behind. That's a powerful idea and it's a noble sentiment, but it's not the same as rights-based legal protections or specific commitments for inclusion and active participation, or for specific mechanisms that give people access to information or means of redress when their rights are not being upheld or trampled by certain kinds of programs. And so I feel very strongly that the rights-based approach is a practical approach that can create that sort of political energy and accountability, which is one of the gaps I think that we've seen in the first 5 years of the rollout and implementation phase of the SDGs.
Thanks very much. Mary Claire, you look at this from a perspective of law. So tell us about law. What role does law play here?
Well, I think to put it simply, because it's always a bit complex to try to kind of summarize a couple of Oxford University Press law textbooks in a few sentences, but there's two places where law can play a fundamental role. And both of them have to do with looking at what we already have in place and what needs to change. So the first one is at the international level. As I alluded to earlier, every sustainable development goal, nearly every target is supported by and assisted by legal regimes that have been 30, 50, 100 years or more in the making. SDG 5, gender equality, is supported by the 1979 Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and its optional protocols, by the International Labor Organization's conventions, by the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the provisions that protect girl children, as well as by the ICCPR and the ACESCR, as Ken was mentioning, in terms of grounder human rights appeals. And if we even just look at SDG 13, climate, we have the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, but we also have the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification and Drought. We have the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Each of these international regimes sets up financing mechanisms, sets up peer review, collaborative capacity building mechanisms, sets up an entire community of supportive civil society organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and others, as Ken has mentioned. And we can use those to advance our work on the SDGs globally. We don't have to say that this is about some kind of charity or international development aid. We can admit that there are stronger promises than that at play. And then second, and just as relevant, are the domestic legislative regimes that either help or hinder, foster or frustrate. And again, just picking only one example, if we look at SDG 7 on clean energy, we can see feed-in tariff regulations, attempts to make space in energy grids for carbon neutral or carbon negative rules for new builds and new construction codes. We can look across and see the rules for subsidies and whether they go to fossil fuels or renewables. And that's just a few examples. There are hundreds appropriate to each level of government and each level of law. It's about having a coherent agenda, knowing where we're going, and then picking the best roads to get us there in the law. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Derek, tell us a little bit from your research perspective, what goals you feel have the highest priority and what role, because you study information technology and communication technologies, fundamentally important at the moment. So what do these technologies play? What role do they play in the implementation of the goals?
Well, I love this discussion, and I like the way Vanessa described thinking about the whole building as opposed to individual beams. And that's one of the things that is certainly happening as we look across the entire spectrum of goals for the disability community. So one of the fundamental alignments with the disability community is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And as Ken talked about, this focus on a rights-based approach. So the CRPD is an international treaty that is both a development instrument and a human rights instrument. So it has all of these development strategies built into it, but also human rights strategies with independent review panels and multi-stakeholder participation and so forth. And like Marie Claire was saying, this sort of legal infrastructure behind the CRPD helps to strengthen those elements of the SDGs that are related to persons with disabilities. So in addition to the CRPD, we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child as well. But then if we look at specific SDGs, so we can think about SDG 4, for example, in education is aligned with Article 24 of the CRPD. So you have the CRPD focusing on accessible education and this broad development goal in SDG 4 around education, SDG 8 on employment, SDG 10 on reduced inequality are both supported by the CRPD as well. And then SDG 11 on cities is supported by the new urban agenda and the need for inclusive access to cities for persons with disabilities. So it's a really phenomenal sort of overlapping of these broad strategies, the whole house, as Vanessa was saying, with these goals of the SDGs. Now, each of these is supported by information and communication technologies. The International Telecommunication Union has issued this matrix that overlays the WSIS action lines, the World Summit on the Information Society, and all of its action lines related to global development with the SDGs. It's a fantastic matrix. If you just Google WSIS action lines and SDGs, you'll see this really cool interface between each of these. Essentially, it's arguing that in order to obtain to achieve each of the SDGs, there's an underlying required infrastructure of information technology that helps to level the playing field. And I'd love to be able to talk about that more if we had time.
Thanks very much. Well, let's hone in, Ken, on your research area too, which is heavily focused on water. This concerns SDG number 6. And what progress specifically in this area do you feel we've achieved in the last 5 years? It's an important resource.
Well, when we talk about progress, we have to talk about before coronavirus and since coronavirus, because, no pun intended, it's an enormous watershed. SDG 6 is quite ambitious. It seeks universal access to safe and affordable water, to protect freshwater ecosystems, which is the source of our water ultimately, to improve the management practices around water systems for better efficiency and sustainability. There is some emphasis in the goal on participation among local communities, although it does fall short of the sort of fully throated rights-based approach that I was talking about a moment ago. Before the coronavirus, progress could best be described, I would say, as uneven. There are a couple of billion people on the planet that lack access to safe drinking water and are forced to rely on unprotected sources, in some cases even contaminated sources of water supply. There's 4 billion people, it's a staggering number, who lack a safely managed system for waterborne sanitation. Now, before the coronavirus, the world was making some significant progress on getting people connected to water and sanitation grids, although that connection's always tenuous if it doesn't also focus on the affordability and the reliability of those services. COVID has shown us how important it is to make accelerated progress on this specific goal. Hand washing is probably the most basic defense against COVID, but it's estimated that fully 40% of the healthcare facilities across the planet lack adequate supplies of soap and water or some sort of alcohol-based hand sanitizer for people to clean their hands. It's estimated that 3 billion people lack the basic facilities in their homes to safely wash their hands. And those are really stark facts that ought to make us stop and pause and reflect. But I do think one of the messages in those facts is that there's a tremendous opportunity to make progress. And it comes back to this idea about the reinforcing character of the goals, because when you solve those problems, you're not simply addressing water, you're addressing public health, you're addressing gender equity, and you're reducing poverty.
Thanks very much, Mary Claire. We're trying to build back better. We're trying to build back green, resilient, safer, inclusive, more stronger. Tell us how we can align this, if at all, with the achieving the SDGs.
Well, I mentioned 2 particular barriers earlier: lack of resources and lack of capacity, a capacity chasm under our feet. So I think 2 very easy ways to align is that we need to take a look at every single pound and every single American dollar and Canadian dollar that we are spending on the recovery effort. And we need to ensure that it aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. Lord Nick Stern has told us that in the 2008 crisis, it was 1 of every $6 that went anything toward any SDG. That means 5 out of 6 weren't supporting. That's frightening, and it's a disgrace. So that alignment, and then of course the efforts of educational institutions, including ours here at the Balsillie School and here in Cambridge, UK as well, is equally crucial. If we're educating and raising awareness and ensuring that all of our professional associations, all of our judges training for the legal field are turning toward assisting to align, then I think we're doing something closer to our real job here. There isn't time for more disconnects. We need to ensure that the 10 trillion that the first 2 months of pandemic recovery packages put on the table are going toward shovel-ready, high employment, SDG related projects. And we're seeing lots of evidence of that in our research, but there's a great deal more opportunity. Thanks.
Let me push you a little bit further on the higher education issue. Tell us exactly what we can be doing out there at the moment.
Well, one example is that I teach the Sustainable Development Goals, both here in Cambridge and also in Canada. And I've taught them in the DR Congo and in Chile and in other universities where I've served as a professor. And I'm invariably one of the only people doing it. What is that? Shouldn't we have professors teaching the SDGs in all our university faculties? Law, engineering, economics, it's relevant, could be making a contribution. And then second, when we're helping students to put together career pathways, when we're transitioning them through co-ops or training programs, when we're looking at lifelong learning under SDG 4 and assisting people to retrain for a new, green, more just economy, these programs have to be aligned with the SDGs, consciously or unconsciously. You know, these are 17 massive challenges. You know, these are the world's largest problems that we need to be solving. And if we're only sending a tiny percent of our graduates toward that work, if we're not very, very deliberately ensuring that our research is aligned with that work and that we are making our research policy relevant and impactful in order to ensure that alignment. I have colleagues here who have been working together with me on a Build Forward report to assist the UK government to literally just assess the trillions of pounds we're putting toward recovery and ensure that they're helping to achieve an SDG target, at least one in each bucket, in each package. That kind of work can be done by researchers. It's kind of our job actually to be doing that kind of work and to be tracking the spending of that money as time goes on and ensuring that the transparency and the awareness of how it's being spent and what it's actually delivering with these sustainable development goals as our ultimate goal could actually really assist our societies to be more responsible with this spending than we've been in the past.
Thank you. Derek, over to you. What factors in your view will limit the potential to achieve the SDGs?
Well, I think that if we don't sufficiently include the voices of the grassroots, the voices of the global disability community and take a multi-stakeholder approach, we'll be significantly limited in our ability to move forward. And I really love what Marie-Claire just said about ensuring that our students, regardless of what program we're working in, are aligned in this area. I teach a capstone seminar on inclusive sustainable development, and I'm trying to get all of my students to align their capstone projects with the SDGs with an eye towards helping them to go out into the development field armed with that background. And I also try to have them aligned with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And like you said, Marie-Claire, the number of faculty members that do that is surprisingly limited. And so I think involving these voices is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Vanessa, imagine for a moment that the year is 2030. What do you see?
Well, hopefully we will have achieved some of our SDGs. I know that in 10 years, sometimes governments can become very focused and they can actually achieve a lot. But also, if I'm being a bit more modest and saying maybe we don't achieve everything, but we at least make good progress. That's what I would really hope to see by 2030. But something that will definitely be coming down the horizon is this question of climate restoration. How do we clean up the greenhouse gas pollution that's in the atmosphere? So it will be interesting to see how some things that maybe people have heard about in the news, trying to tie together things like how do we manage our forests and what does this mean for protecting biodiversity, but maybe also doing something about the greenhouse gas problem. I think that those kinds of issues will certainly start to enter even more in these development conversations. Whereas right now, when we hear about climate, we hear about adaptation, perhaps mitigation, but not so much about restoration. I think that's something that we can expect to hear more about by the time we get to 2030.
Thank you. And Ken, quickly, what steps would you like to see the world take to stay on track?
Well, I certainly agree with the points that were made already about policy changes, funding, implementation, participation. But beyond that, I think there are two keys. First, at the domestic level, I'd love to see the governments of the world take a page from the medical community and embrace an approach of first do no harm. There are many, many opportunities to simply step back from misguided policy approaches that fuel the problems the SDGs are trying to rectify. One very quick example, subsidies. Whether it's fishing fleets, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, whether it's misguided agricultural practices that degrade land and displace people, there's a great potential in a first do no harm approach. Second, we do have to tackle the continuing structural barriers in the world economy. There are ways in which the trading system inhibits exports for livelihoods from some of the poorest countries in the world. There are serious problems with the debt and investment financing models. There's an emphasis on privatization that sometimes outstrips the evidence that privatization actually works for the world's poor. And those structural problems create a sort of a layer of concrete that even the best intentioned domestic policy frameworks can't punch through. So we have to engage that as well.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to some of the questions that we're getting in through various feeds now. Derek, I'd like to put the first one to you. Can new technologies like AI, artificial intelligence, be leveraged to help achieve the SDGs?
Certainly. And before I address that, I just wanted to go back quickly to something that Ken said around the impact of COVID. So one of the things that's happened is the increased use of these distributed collaboration tools like we're using today that can have an impact on education and collaboration amongst advocacy networks and so forth. So this is one way. I've been teaching online since 1998 and have been trying to get more people to teach online and engage this way. And it's been sort of an uphill battle. And now everybody recognizes how valuable these distributed techniques are. So I just wanted to say that. But quickly in terms of AI, so I'm involved in a number of UN related initiatives on data and development. So we have something called Monitoring and Evaluation of Disability and Development. It's an expert network that UN DESA organizes. And one of the things we're looking at is how data analytics and machine learning and as a subset of artificial intelligence can help us point to particular solutions to problems that we're facing.
Thank you. Vanessa, a question for you. Who should be the designers and architects of your global blueprint? And does this not bring us right back to the crisis of multilateralism?
So as far as the designers and the architects, I think I like the concert analogy a bit better, but it was more that I was trying to sort of remind us, when we look at a blueprint, we don't just look at the pieces, we look at the whole thing as well. And so if in a concert, you want to be playing a piece that sort of invites other people to come on over with their wooden spoon and metal pot from their kitchen and also join, if that is the only instrument they happen to have. And so to the extent that we can perhaps send it, and I want to also echo what Marie-Claire said about is the scientific community doing some useful research in this regard? As an example, I'm working with some students and a former student on a project where we are looking at that complexity of the SDGs, and we're actually trying to extract some strategic information based on how we see the various ways that these SDGs interact together as an entire system. What are some implications about key SDGs where we cannot fail on them? And can we identify things like the Keystone SDGs and so forth? What I'm trying to say about this particular example is that that kind of research that can sort of invite contributions from whomever and however they can, but then being very focused on, okay, specifically we need help on these areas, or we really can't fail in this particular corner, being able to have that very specific policy relevant advice. That's what I would say. If the scientific community can help give some direction to policymakers on that, that's the way that we can do a good job.
Thank you very much. Marie-Claire, a question for you about your comment on budgets and resources. And the question is If budgets and resources are the most crucial difficulties in realizing the SDGs, does this not privilege the voices and solutions of the wealthy and powerful? What voices are at risk of being ignored or overpowered, and how can we ensure they are heard?
I think we need to take a very careful look at what we mean by resources. One thing that I've seen very clearly is that not having the resources available has already been given as an excuse for decades when we've got binding treaty commitments that we've been ignoring or that have been politically uncomfortable for us. I don't think that it's a sufficient condition to have the resources needed, but I think that it certainly is a good start. And right now, at this particular juncture in history, we have governments taking on public debt at a scale that we haven't seen possibly ever, certainly since the Marshall Plan. And so I want to be certain that that resource injection is aligned with the SDGs. That's not the same thing as saying that the contribution of Fiji to their Green Climate Fund as part of their post-pandemic recovery isn't just as valuable, even though it measures in the hundreds or the millions instead of the trillions. It's also not to say that the contributions of a community group at the local level to reforestation as part of pandemic recovery and nature-based solutions to climate change isn't relevant just because we've set in place new rules for disclosure of climate risk for the Fortune 500 companies. What I am asking is to make sure we don't make the wrong choices. One of the motivators for the research that we are doing now that has led to the Leverhulme Professorship and some of the work in the Climate Law and Governance Initiative under the UNFCCC was actually to read announcements by governments of plans to use pandemic spending to subsidize oil and gas pipelines. I mean, what planet are we living on? And so that, I think, is the first step, ensuring that every dollar we are spending is aligned. The steps that are just as important is ensuring that the work that we are doing now to ensure that our economies are matched with achieving the SDGs that are most essential to us doesn't have to be a work of trillions. It can be a work of the informal economy, recognizing that participation of women entrepreneurs in microenterprise requires support and encouragement and the taking down of the barriers that are already there. And that's just as important in facilitating the resources needed as a decision by the Treasury. Thanks.
Thank you. Ken, what will you be looking for from the Biden administration?
Well, that is the question, indeed, that we're all anxiously hovering around and waiting to see, and I think kind of trying to read the tea leaves at the moment. Part of it comes back, I think, to my earlier comment about do no harm, right? I think there are many ways in which simply reconnecting with the dialogue, recognizing that nobody has all the answers on this and that what we need is a kind of a rich and broadly based conversation and, you know, let 100 flowers bloom in different approaches. I think that would be a kind of a welcome return to a slightly more kind of, you know, sober and consistent and focused American foreign policy. I do think we're going to see divided government in the United States, regardless of what happens with the last few Senate seats that many of us are intensely curious about. And I think there are many things that can be done. There are opportunities through executive action to simply restore things the United States had started to do in the Obama administration with the Clean Power Plan and with higher fuel economy standards and so on. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that I believe can be picked. Maybe a little bit provocatively, one of my hopes is that the focus is not so overwhelmingly on climate change, that a lot of the day-to-day problems facing the world's poor, while climate change is going to smack them hard, it often doesn't grab their attention as much as some other rudimentary sorts of things. And so I hope we don't simply think about climate change in terms of fossil fuel emissions, mitigation, and the Paris Agreement, absolutely vital though that is. I hope that we also recognize that there's an adaptation agenda, that there's a resilience agenda, that there's a risk management agenda around floods and droughts and wildfires and hurricanes. We've already bought into a degree of climate change. And the SDGs are speaking to the lives of people who are not responsible for that fact. But the way that they experience climate change is not going to be through mitigation and the Paris Agreement. It's going to be drought. It's going to be flooding. It's going to be extreme weather. And I think that's an agenda that it's going to be crucially important to put front and center with the activities of US foreign policy, US diplomacy, the US Agency for International Development. And so I'll be looking for signs of that as part of the agenda going forward.
Thank you very much. Vanessa, just on this orchestra, there's another comment that recognizes that, systems thinking and systems dynamics and the use of influence diagrams and critical path solutions play a major role. Do you see this happening anywhere?
Oh, yeah. And so that's where, when I was mentioning that I'm part of an ongoing project, the American Geophysical Union this December actually will be having a series of presentations for folks who are interested in things like transitions, sustainability transitions, and so forth. So there is that community of scientists who are starting to come around to focusing on this and delivering the kind of policy relevant science that I'm describing. And it's not only scientists who recognize that this is important. The OECD also has written reports on how governments really need to look for opportunities for policy coherence. And I know in the remarks from the panel here, we've been talking about alignment. And so I think that one of the things that might be a little bit of a paradigm shift for some decision makers, but I hope wouldn't be too big of one, is that when you're considering your different policies and figuring out how a new policy will fit within an existing architecture, consider systemic effects of that policy. Could it perhaps elevate certain systemic efficiencies instead of what I sometimes hear as a rather narrow perspective on whether or not a policy looks any good, perhaps by only focusing on things like benefit cost analysis. So I think that the SDGs are an example of that framework that asks us to look at the holistic view of our policies and what they're achieving and try to get us to break out of very narrow, siloed perspectives.
Okay, thank you. Last question for you, Derek, on the governance, good governance, and how this features or doesn't feature in the goals at the national policy level, and to try to drive out the toxic nature of some decision-making processes. Can you comment on that? Where is the emphasis on good governance across the goals?
Wow, I don't focus as much on governance at the national level as I do on global governance. I think Ken has highlighted, at least in the US, some of the needs for national level governance and re-engagement at a national level with some of these policy areas. And in fact, that's what's so critical, because at the global level, that sets the broad strategic framework, but this has to be implemented at a national level in national legislation and in national policy. And so having a procedure and a process for engagement at that national level is absolutely critical to help achieve those global strategies.
Thank you very much. To all of you, we have policymakers in the audience today. Share with them your top tip in 15 or less seconds. Mary Claire, you first.
Sure. Alignment. Ensure that the next 10 or 15 days of policymaking to recover from the pandemic, and then the next 10 years are fully aligned with the SDGs. There's enough there to keep us all busy.
Yeah, great, thank you. Ken, your top tip.
Embrace rights-based approaches, embrace a first do no harm policy, and put front and center the synergies among the goals, as in the example I gave, where water, poverty reduction, gender equity are all achieved in a reinforcing way by specific actions.
Thank you. Vanessa.
I would echo what we've heard, alignment / coherence, and how also efforts that are already very important on certain SDGs. I, of course, am looking at things from the energy side, and also some of that analysis I've described. We see energy as being really key, but energy connects. It's an infrastructural exercise similar to water. You can achieve multiple other SDGs by developing a clean energy system.
Derek, finish us off.
I would say ditto to what all my colleagues have said, synergy and alignment. And from the perspective of the global disability community, nothing about us without us. Actively involve and include the voices of persons with disabilities in all areas of SDG implementation, including data analysis and evaluation.
Thank you to all four panelists. Brilliant session, and your views are rich. You're very, very bright people, and I hope you continue your good work out there and support this world and take us to a better place. On behalf of all of the institutional partners, I want to thank everyone for joining us over these last 10 weeks. We're taking a break until January, and we will be back to take a critical look at other more pressing issues facing humanity. Until then, take care, stay safe, and enjoy a well-deserved holiday. Bye-bye.